In the late 1890s and early 1900s, the Japanese port town of Nagasaki had become the new Wild Wild West. Sailors from all over the world, both military and civilian, would stop in the harbor, in theory to refuel, but in practice, to get drunk and then find some willing, or not, Japanese women. So the story of the geisha Cho-Cho-san and her American naval husband isn't unique, but that doesn't make it any less heartbreaking. So grab your tissues, and let's explore the history, the characters, and the inspiration of one of Puccini's most well-known operas, Madama Butterfly. Today, on Scores Unstitched. Madama Butterfly was a contemporary opera for audiences when it premiered in 1904, giving them a window into both current life in Japan and the effects of imperialism. The story opens with an American naval officer stationed on a warship called the Abraham Lincoln, who's come to port in Nagasaki. Now, for us, 120 years later, the name Nagasaki kind of makes us think of something entirely different from audiences in 1904. It's actually really hard to find out anything about why the US even had warships in the Nagasaki harbor then, because, well, you can imagine what Google says about Americans and Nagasaki now. But thankfully, why Americans were in Japan isn't nearly as important as the simple fact that they were. What is more important for the story of Madama Butterfly is a little history of geishas and the far-reaching side effects of foreign men on Japanese shores. So, in the early 1800s, Japan had been secluded from the rest of the world for over 150 years, and there was this cultural phenomenon taking off inside the borders of the geisha. For those who didn't read and watch Memoirs of a Geisha like 8 times a week in high school, geishas were Japanese courtesans who worked in tea shops or cafes, and they were these mysterious and ethereal sort of women, and while their work wasn't necessarily honorable, they were certainly respected. But after Japan opened its harbors to the world again in 1853, that started to go downhill. These new foreign sailors didn't respect the status, I guess, of geishas, and just treated them like the prostitutes they were used to back home. So by the end of the 1890s, the era of the trained and sophisticated geisha had basically been reduced to just brothel work. Being a geisha was considered shameful, a profession for poor women and girls who had nowhere else to turn. So of course, there were a lot who really didn't want to be doing it. Luckily for them, the streets were swarming with these foreign men who were fascinated by beautiful, exotic new women, and they would do and say anything to satisfy their baser needs. Not all, of course, but many. And for those girls who hadn't yet seen the widespread Western abuse of Asian women, they'd believe the sailors when they said they loved them. They'd believe their marriages to them were real. And then they'd spend their lives waiting for those sailors to come back once they'd left. Of course, for their husbands, the whole thing was just pretend. And more often than not, those sailors would go back home, like coming back from Las Vegas, get married to a real Western woman, and at best, not realize they'd ruined the life of their Japanese bride, and at worst, not cared. It's honestly awful how often that happened. And the opera of Madama Butterfly is the ultimately tragic story of one of those Japanese women. The whole thing takes place over a span of 3 years, presumably 1904 to 1907, and the plot revolves around our 2 main characters as well as a few side characters. But first and foremost, we have Cho-Cho-san, or Butterfly, who the opera is named after. And she's a 15-year-old geisha. I'm honestly always amazed that a story that includes misogyny, racism, imperialism, and underage sex can still be one of the most beautiful and heartbreaking operas ever written. Her soon-to-be husband is Benjamin Franklin Pinkerton. Yes, really. He's a playboy lieutenant in the US Navy who openly admits to his friend, Sharpless, that he's only marrying Cho-Cho-san out of lust. And once he goes back to the States in a few weeks, he'll go find a real American wife. They have their wedding night, plus a few presumably happy and lustful weeks afterwards, before Pinkerton leaves for America again. 3 years later, he still hasn't come back. And even though her maid and closest thing to a friend, Suzuki, tries to convince her that he straight up left, she refuses to believe it. But then, one day, Sharpless shows up with a letter from Pinkerton telling her that he's coming back to Nagasaki. But not for her. And how the rest of the story unfolds, I'll leave for the performers to tell when you go to see the show. So with that basic plot and context aside, let's dive into the musical side of Madama Butterfly. Madama Butterfly was composed by Giacomo Puccini, with a libretto by Illica and Giacosa, the pair who'd also worked with him on La Bohème, and Tosca. Seriously, like, what a trio. The opera was based on a short story by the American author John Luther Long. That story was then turned into a play by the American playwright and director David Belasco, which had enough success in the States to be taken to London, which is where Puccini saw it in the summer of 1900. Interestingly, the play Puccini saw had Cho-Cho-san performing her role with a fake English accent, something that definitely would have been seen by the English audience as patronizing, childish, and, yes, racist. It was apparently designed to turn the audience against Cho-Cho-san as someone who was as much to blame for her own downfall as Pinkerton himself. But that linguistic nuance was completely lost on Puccini, whose English was so bad he was basically just watching facial expressions. So between that and his own anti-imperialist sentiments, he saw the humanity in Cho-Cho-san, and his operatic version redeems her as the innocent and coerced 15-year-old she really was. Actually, Puccini and his librettists were determined to do the story justice, and the libretto is unflinchingly real in its depiction of sexual exploitation of both a minor and an Asian woman by a Western man. Illica traveled to Nagasaki to immerse himself in the setting while he was writing, and Puccini made multiple visits to the wife of the Japanese ambassador to Italy, and she would sing songs for him and even gave him sheet music that he studied and incorporated all over the place in the opera. But even with all that care, opening night was such a disaster that Puccini was forced to withdraw it before it even had a second performance. The booing and the hissing was so unexpected and over the top that historians actually think now that some of Puccini's more jealous rivals probably paid people in the audience to do it. And it worked. But not for long. Puccini and his librettists revised the opera, splitting the second act in two, and also making some pretty serious changes to both the vocal and the instrumental lines. And the next performance, a year later, did so much better that the opera was picked up essentially worldwide. But that didn't stop Puccini from continuing to revise it until his friends gave him an intervention, probably after the fifth time. Like, enough already, she's fine, move on. And that fifth version is what's now performed today. Now, Madama Butterfly itself is 3 acts long, but with only one intermission, since the second and third act are usually combined. The first act runs about an hour, while the second and third are about 90 minutes. So make sure you do get to the bathroom in that 30-minute intermission. Although actually, if you do have to go, there's an 8-minute window in the intermezzo between acts 2 and 3, and you're not going to miss any plot really, just a lot of pretty music and scene setting. Now, something interesting about this opera, which is a perfect representation of both the Romantic era of the music and the character-driven plot, is that it's kind of hard to tell when any arias are happening. The plot never really stops moving forward because the plot is basically character development. The music is also really florid and decorative with these long phrases throughout, even when it's just dialogue, so it's really difficult to tell the difference between a solo and just long talking. What are obvious throughout the score, though, are a lot of these traditional Japanese melodies that Puccini did manage to work into the opera. Like, seriously, a ton. So we're just gonna look at a handful here. The one that's used the most frequently was a tune called Echigo Jishi, the Lion of Echigo. Nessuno si confessa mai nato in povertà, non c'è vagabondo che a sentirlo non sia. And then another one was Mia-san, My Prince, which is fittingly used all over the place as Prince Yamadori tries to persuade Cho-Cho-san to marry him in Act 2. And then, of course, how could any Japanese-based music possibly be complete without some kind of reference to Sakura, or the world-famous cherry blossom song? This melody is completely unbroken as Cho-Cho-san is showing her possessions to Pinkerton for the first time. Like I said, there are loads more, so I've just dropped a link to the chart that I referenced in the description box below if you're curious to see where the rest of them are. Now, there are also a handful of lovely arias in this opera, but far and away the most famous in not just this opera, but almost the entire soprano repertoire is Un bel dì, One Fine Day. that Cho-Cho-san sings in Act 2 as she tries to convince herself and Suzuki that Pinkerton is coming back. Someday. Now I want to talk a little about this aria and this role in general really, because a first-time opera goer might be a little confused when the curtains open and an obviously middle-aged Cho-Cho-san comes on stage, and there are a couple things going on here. First is the music. Now we know opera is performed without amplification, so no mics, so opera singers need to be able to project their voices over an entire orchestra so you can both hear them and understand them. The thing is, not all composers and orchestrations are the same. So when a composer like Puccini writes these huge instrumentations with trumpets and French horns and percussion and pretty much anything else that makes you feel like you're screaming in a nightclub, that requires a really specific voice to be able to sing over that without a microphone. That already doesn't really fit a 15-year-old girl. But then on top of that, opera has been just as subjected to inflation as everything else in the last 120 years. In Puccini's time, someone in their late 20s could definitely have sung this role. Opera singers in general had lighter voices back then, and audiences were also a lot less willing to accept singers who didn't look like the characters they were portraying. But nowadays, we really like big voices. Opera houses now, generally speaking, care more about vocal weight than accurate character representation. And this is where I have a bit of an unpopular opinion. I really miss the youth in opera when youth is clearly called for, which is why I'm going to give any Butterfly first-timers some maybe weird advice. I recommend watching the movie first, specifically this one, directed by Frédéric Mitterrand in 1995. I spent a long time thinking I didn't like this opera because I just couldn't get past the people on stage not looking like the characters they were supposed to be. But in this movie, someone finally created a believable cast, all of them opera singers, and just the youth, the naivete, the number of tissues. This was the production that changed my mind about Madama Butterfly, and it has English subtitles. And as of the filming of this video, it's available completely for free on YouTube, and I've dropped a link to it in the description box below. And that's Madama Butterfly. Always controversial, always heartbreaking, and I think always worth seeing. Now, I know the opinions about this opera can stretch the gamut, and I would love to hear your comments on the piece, art, politics, modern interpretations, but just remember that art naturally sparks debate, and guys, please just be respectful. That's it for now. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like if you made it all the way here, and I'll see you next time on Scores Unstitched.